North Africa, 1942. Across the burning desert, two armies prepared for a battle that would become one of the most famous confrontations of the Second World War. German tanks pushed through the dust, while Allied forces watched and waited. At the center of it all stood Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Rommel's forces moved quickly across the desert, relying on speed, surprise, and aggressive maneuvering. But waiting ahead was a commander who had studied the Desert Fox carefully, Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery knew that defeating Rommel would require more than courage. He needed patience, intelligence, and overwhelming strength. As the two armies prepared for the coming clash, the desert became a giant chessboard. For months, Rommel had outmaneuvered his opponents across the desert. But now Montgomery had a new advantage: time, supplies, and a plan designed to force Rommel into a battle he could not escape. Then came the moment Montgomery had been waiting for. His forces were ready, his artillery was positioned, and thousands of men were preparing to strike. The desert was about to erupt. As darkness fell, the Allied guns began to move into position. Crews checked their weapons one final time. Across the desert, Rommel's soldiers waited, unaware of the storm that was coming. Then, without warning, the desert exploded. Allied artillery opened fire, sending shells crashing into the German positions. The silence was gone. The battle had begun. Shells tore across the battlefield as Allied tanks began advancing through the smoke. German crews scrambled to respond. But Montgomery's attack was already gaining momentum. But Rommel's forces were not finished. German tanks turned toward the advancing British armor, preparing to strike back. But Montgomery had anticipated the counterattack. His forces were prepared, and the German armor was moving straight into his trap. His forces were waiting in prepared positions, and thousands of Allied troops were ready to strike. Rommel's tanks were entering a battlefield he could no longer control. Then the Allied guns opened fire. Artillery crashed into the German positions, forcing Rommel's tanks to fight their way through a wall of steel and smoke. Under heavy fire, Rommel's armor pushed forward. But every advance came at a cost, as Allied guns continued to pound the battlefield. But Montgomery's strategy was beginning to work. The German advance slowed as Allied forces tightened, the pressure from every direction. With his supply lines under pressure and Allied defenses holding firm, Rommel faced a difficult choice: continue the attack, or pull his forces back before it was too late. Rommel knew the battle was slipping away. He ordered his commanders to begin a fighting withdrawal, hoping to save what remained of his armored force. But the Allied pressure was relentless. German tanks began pulling back, leaving behind a battlefield covered in smoke and burning wreckage. German tanks began pulling back, leaving behind a battlefield covered in smoke and burning wreckage. For Rommel, the retreat marked a turning point. The desert battlefield was no longer his to control. The German forces had been pushed back, and the cost of the battle was becoming impossible to ignore. And the Allies were beginning to seize the initiative. Rommel knew he had only one choice: withdraw before his army was trapped. Under cover of darkness, the German columns began their withdrawal westward. Behind them, Allied forces continued to advance, closing the distance with every passing hour. Rommel's army was running out of room, supplies, and time. The retreat continued westward, as exhausted German troops struggled to keep their units together. Behind them, Allied forces continued to advance, capturing ground that Rommel could no longer hold. Rommel's army was running out of room, supplies, and time. The Allied advance was closing the gap, leaving Rommel with fewer and fewer options. German commanders realized that every mile they retreated brought the Allies closer to cutting off their escape. The Allies were no longer simply chasing Rommel. They were closing the trap. They were closing the trap from both sides. The German retreat was becoming a rout. Vehicles were abandoned, supplies were left behind, and the desert became a trail of wreckage. And the Allies kept moving forward. The battlefield was no longer in doubt. Rommel's forces had been decisively beaten, but the victory came at a cost. Thousands had been killed, wounded, or captured. For Rommel, the defeat marked the beginning of the end. The defeat in North Africa had changed the course of the war. For the Axis forces, the road ahead would only become harder. The Allies had gained control of North Africa, and the next phase of the war was already beginning. And the next phase of the war would take the Allies into Europe. But Rommel's story in North Africa was coming to an end. His battlefield command in Africa was over, but his role in the war was not yet finished.
Rommel knew that the war was changing, and Germany was running out of options. Soon, Rommel would be drawn into a new battlefield, one far from the sands of North Africa.